the 17th of October, 1944. The war tore across Europe like a storm without mercy. But inside, a dark, cramped basement beneath an abandoned German outpost near Metz, a small group of women sat motionless in the shadows. They had no weapons, no uniforms, no ranks. They were not prisoners in the traditional military sense. They were captives forced into serving German troops as comfort women, stripped of dignity, freedom, and any sense of humanity. Days blended together into a cycle of fear and humiliation, and nights were even worse. They had forgotten the sound of kindness. They had forgotten that people could speak without shouting. They had forgotten what it meant to be treated like human beings. When German soldiers retreated from the region, the women heard the boots rushing up the stairs, the shouts, the panic. The final slam of the metal door echoed like a death sentence. They believed they had been abandoned to starve, or worse, to be discovered and harmed by whoever arrived next. For them, the world had only shown cruelty, so their minds could not imagine anything else. They waited in silence, listening to artillery rumbling in the distance, growing louder by the hour. None of them dared hope that liberation was possible. Hope was a luxury that life had beaten out of them long ago. When American forces finally stormed the outpost, the sound of the explosion that shattered the cellar door made all of the women collapse to their knees, covering their ears. Boots thundered down the steps. Rifles pointed into the darkness. Flashlights cut through the thick, musty air. The women screamed and tried to hide, expecting the worst. But instead of aggression, something unexpected happened. One American soldier froze the moment. His light revealed their terrified faces. He lowered his rifle slowly, confusion and deep sadness washing over him. "They're not soldiers," he whispered to the others. The soldiers stepped forward with caution, not to harm but to reassure. One of them removed his heavy jacket and placed it gently over the shoulders of the woman closest to him. She flinched at first, conditioned to expect violence. But when she felt the warmth of the coat and the absence of force, she broke down instantly. Tears poured from her eyes. She didn't know the man's language, but she understood the gesture. Another soldier knelt several feet away from a trembling woman, raising his hands with soft, calming movements. He didn't touch her. He didn't command her. He simply said, "It's okay. You're safe now." A medic arrived moments later. Seeing the state of the women, exhausted, dehydrated, bruised, and emotionally shattered, he immediately called for blankets and water. The medics wrapped each woman slowly and respectfully, covering them, not because they were prisoners, but because they were human. The blankets weren't just fabric. They were the first act of kindness the women had felt in months. Several collapsed from emotional overload, sobbing into the cloth, unable to comprehend why these new soldiers were helping them rather than hurting them. The Americans brought food next. Not rations tossed carelessly on the floor, but carefully prepared, warm broth, bread, and canned fruit. One woman cried the moment the spoon touched her lips. Another clutched her bowl tightly, afraid it might be stolen away. A soldier noticed her fear and whispered gently, "It's yours, eat." She didn't understand the words, but she understood, the tone gentle, patient, reassuring. A female American nurse later joined them, offering the kind of care the women had forgotten existed. She cleaned wounds with a soft touch, speaking soothingly, even though the women could not understand her language. Kindness doesn't need translation. As the hours passed, the cellar transformed from a place of torment into a place of healing. The Americans set up makeshift beds, placed lanterns to brighten the room, and positioned guards outside, not to imprison the women, but to keep others away, so they could rest without fear. For the first time in months, the women slept without threats hovering over them. The sound of rifles being fired in anger was replaced by the quiet breathing of soldiers, standing watch to protect them. When translators eventually arrived and learned the women's story, the American officers were horrified. These women were not enemies. They were victims of the regime the Allies were fighting to destroy. When they heard this, many of the American soldiers lowered their heads, realizing the depth of suffering the war had inflicted on innocents. The women learned the truth, slowly. they were safe. No one would harm them. No one would force them to serve again. The Americans had not come as conquerors. They had come as liberators. That night, several of the women gathered near the entrance of the cellar, looking up at the faint moonlight, for the first time in what felt like ages. Some cried quietly, some whispered prayers, some simply breathed freely, letting the cold air fill their lungs. Freedom felt unreal. Safety felt unbelievable. Kindness felt impossible. And yet, it was happening. For the first time in a very long time, they allowed themselves to believe in tomorrow. In the final years of World War II, when Europe was collapsing under the weight of destruction, cruelty, and desperation, there existed a silent corner of suffering that rarely appeared in official reports. These were the women, mostly from Eastern Europe, who had been forced into sexual servitude for German soldiers. They had no names in the documents, no identities in the archives, and no voice in the chaos of war. Their world was cold, dim, and suffocating, built on fear, humiliation, and survival. Yet something happened near the end of the conflict that changed their lives forever. It did not erase their trauma, but it gave them, for the first time in years, a moment of dignity. When the Americans finally broke through German defensive lines and began liberating occupied territories, they had very little idea of the hidden horrors waiting inside abandoned towns, makeshift barracks, and underground bunkers. They expected to find wounded soldiers, destroyed supply depots, or starving civilians. What they did not expect was to find rooms full of terrified women who flinched at the sound of boots and froze whenever a man entered the doorway. For these women, any group of uniformed soldiers, no matter their like another wave of torment. Many of them had spent months being controlled, threatened, and abused. When American troops discovered the first group inside a damaged building near the outskirts of Leipzig, the reaction of the women was immediate. They pressed themselves against the walls, curled into corners, and covered their faces as if preparing for punishment. Their bodies trembled, their breathing shook, and their eyes showed only fear. One American soldier later wrote in his diary that the women behaved as though liberation itself was another form of danger. The American Medic Corps arrived soon after, carrying blankets, water, and medical supplies. But the simple gesture of offering help became complicated when the women refused to come near them. Trauma had taught them that any man approaching them meant pain. So the medics kept their distance, placing blankets on the floor, sliding food gently toward the women, and lowering their voices to the softest tone possible. Slowly, after minutes that felt like hours, one woman stepped forward. Her knees were weak, her face hollow, but her eyes desperate. When an American soldier wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, she immediately broke down. Tears soaked the rough wool fabric as she cried, not from relief, but from overwhelming disbelief. She had expected harshness, but received warmth. The women were then moved to a nearby field hospital. Their female nurses were brought in to provide care, understanding that male presence might re-traumatize them. The nurses spoke calmly, reassured them, and gave them privacy. The women ate real food for the first time in months. They were bathed, clothed, and placed in clean beds. The change was so abrupt, so gentle, that many of them cried again, this time out of confusion. Freedom did not make sense to them yet. They had forgotten what dignity even felt like. The American officers filed reports noting the condition of the women: bruises, infections, malnutrition, and psychological shock. Some were so traumatized that they slept sitting upright, fearing attacks in the night. Others asked permission before drinking water, as if any resource belonged exclusively to their captors. The nurses encouraged them to rest, to heal, and to speak only when ready. One woman, identified only as Alyssa, shared her story with an American interpreter. She had been taken from her village in 1943. When German troops swept through eastern Poland, her father had resisted, and she witnessed his arrest. Then she was transported across the border with other women, kept in locked quarters, and forced to serve soldiers for nearly 2 years. Speaking hurt her, but silence hurt more. When she finished, she collapsed into the nurse's arms, sobbing violently. The interpreter later said that her tears were like the end of a storm. No one knew how to stop. As more towns fell to Allied forces, similar scenes repeated themselves. Women held prisoner inside brothels, bunkers, and abandoned facilities were discovered in equally broken conditions. Their first reaction was fear. Their second was disbelief. Their third, when blankets wrapped around their shoulders and warm food entered their hands, was tears. Tears for lost innocence. Tears for the cruelty they endured. Tears because someone finally treated them as human. These moments deeply affected the American soldiers as well. Hardened by battle, they were accustomed to gunfire, mines, and death. But seeing women stripped of identity and humanity forced them to confront an entirely different dimension of war. Many wrote letters home, describing not the battles they fought, but the victims they found. Their bravery on the battlefield seemed small compared to the strength of the women, who had survived years of torment. When peace was finally declared, the women were transferred to rehabilitation centers. There, the healing process began slowly. Not all wounds were visible. Some would never fully heal, but the moment Americans covered them with blankets, gave them food, and spoke to them, gently remained etched in their memories. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness become the greatest turning points. They were victims of a dark chapter in history, but in their tears, in their fragile steps toward healing, they also became symbols of resilience. And when the war ended, their stories, once hidden in the shadows, finally saw light.